I know I'm a couple of days late on this, but with all this talk about what the dark age of the FGC was, even though I'm not a proper part of it or whatever, I figure I can add my 2 cents without much consequence. So, for clarity's sake, let's say the Dark Ages is from 2000 to 2008, since that's when most of the complaining happened. Like, the SRK forums are mostly gone from that time, but, just take my word for it. So for many years, the Dark Age was described in casual conversations as a time where, quote, there were no new games, end quote. If you look at interviews of top players after the fact, whenever the topic came up, that was the general response, quote, no new games, end quote. And because that was the typical response, the term itself became descriptive of a certain type of player. For some, including myself, the Dark Age was a North America-centric phenomenon because most of the tourneys in North America were organized by Capcom fans, and Capcom didn't make or publish a new, well-received fighting game until Street Fighter IV's release in Japanese arcades. Other regions ran tourneys on a regular basis, usually because they still had some arcades left or they had an equivalent, like game shops or hole-in-the-wall arcade rooms in the back of a candy shop or something, where you pay like $10 XCD for 10 minutes of gameplay, and they'd advertise them, run them, and have these tournaments. This was contested recently by some of the elder statespeople of the FGC within the last 2 weeks or so, and from what I understand, their idea of it is that it's more than just a lack of games from Capcom. The Dark Age represents the lack of stability in competitive events, interest or understanding from the public at large, support from the developers, and just general hype. This was the same period of time when arcades went on the decline, and as such it became far more difficult to organize large tourneys or regional tourneys, not just your typical GameStop or Game Shop gathering, but the type of events you see year-round nowadays like Final Round or Canada Cup. I'm tempted to say that if the Dark Age was really based around TO struggles, then it's nowhere near over, but I'm not a TO and I don't know what makes their lives easier or harder. But my point is, it seems like there's a broader view of what made fighting games lose their prestige in this new take, and that's what the quote-unquote discourse has been built around in the last few days. As someone who got into fighting games in the 2000s, I agree that there's some truth to this new version of events. Fighting games take a while to learn how to play, and most reviewers aren't going to be able to take 2 weeks to a month to properly review a fighting game. And the arcade situation was pretty bad. Arcades were folding, like I said before, and amusement centers were starting to retire their fighting game cabs. I did mention that people were going to homemade arcades and back rooms to compete, but those were dangerous. Going to a LAN center for a tourney didn't just mean you could get your ass kicked, for example. It meant you were probably going to get it kicked in some out-of-the-way corner of downtown or on the edge of civilization. I think there's some real merit to this argument, and while I don't accept it as the real version of events, I do think that it adds some important context. It's revisionist history, but in the way that history is ideally revised, in an additive way. That said, there's some other aspects that are still being glossed over, at least from what I'm seeing, and I want to point them out. So let's start with a video interview with Perfect Legend on Bleacher Report's website. The title's Perfect Legend on Evo, the FGC is out of the Dark Ages, thanks to streaming. I don't really want to play the video itself because I might get flagged, but I'll pin it in a comment below this video. And I don't want to put too much weight on this interview, because it's only one perspective from two individuals who only represent themselves, but as an unrehearsed conversation, I think it illustrated how the Dark Age was described before 2021. The video interview is over 3 minutes long, and around the 1 minute and 21 second mark, the interviewer, Malik Forte, remarks to Perfect Legend that Evo, specifically, has moved from ballrooms to convention centers, and even gets coverage on ESPN2. This was in 2016, you see. And asks Perfect if he thinks the growth of the FGC is organic. Perfect agreed with Forte, and went on to describe the transitional period between the arcade era and the online era to Forte to illustrate how far things have come. One thing he specifically said at the start was, quote, there is a dark age where there were no new fighting games or none for a while, end quote, referring to the stretch of games between 2006 and 2009, with the exception of Tekken 5 Dark Resurrection, which he described as a difficult title for most people to get their hands on. This span of time is considerably different from the standard gap between 2000 and 2008, but it makes sense. In this very interview, Perfect Legend mentions that he got into the competitive fighting game circuit because of his desire to compete and improve in Dead or Alive 4. Dead or Alive 4 came out in December 29th, 2005, exclusively for the Xbox 360. That's as late of a cutoff point as you can get. It also dovetails very well with the rise of esports, which really caught on in the mainstream when Major League Gaming started broadcasting some of their events on channels like G4, which in turn would be clipped and distributed to CCTV for retail stores like GameStop and Target and the like, at least in the States. I know esports were popular before that outside of the US, I'm just generally describing how it was in the States. DOA 4 was one of the games in MLG circuit and it got a bit of buzz thanks to that. It makes sense to me that Perfect Legend's on-the-spot assessment of the fighting game drought goes from 06 to 09 since there was a lack of new, high-pedigree, heavily promoted games that were pointed towards the esports circuit in that period. Obviously, I can point to games like Virtua Fighter 5 Online, Battle Fantasia, Mortal Kombat Armageddon, ZBZ Budokai Tenkaichi 2, and Godzilla Unleashed as fighting games that came out at the time, but none of those meet that lofty criteria. I feel like that's the kicker, really. Fighting games were coming out for consoles all the time between 2000 and 2009, but they were either revisions, like Virtua Fighter 5 Online, licensed stuff like the Budokai or Naruto 18 games, rough around the edges like Battle Fantasia, or intimidating to play like, well, Virtua Fighter 5 Online. Games were being released, but they weren't being advertised very well at the time. Tourneys were run unofficially back on forums, and sometimes retail stores ran tourneys for games within their release windows, but they weren't getting onto the esports circuit. I got into fighting games in 06, and I can tell you that if it wasn't a licensed fighting game, most of the people I hung out with weren't messing around with it. But at the same time, I'd think that scenes built around games like Budokai, Naruto GNT, or Melty Blood, or SNK's PS2 Renaissance would count. They're fighting games, they had tourneys with cash prizes, you'd think they'd count, but that doesn't seem to matter. If I go back to the point of contention, that it was the difficulty in getting tourneys running again that marked the dark ages, well, we've been in the streaming age for a while now. We've seen the stuff TOs have to deal with, and even if the overall organization has gotten better, tourneys are still a blow-up, especially now that a bunch of them have either gone on hiatus or moved online. It's due to extenuating circumstances, sure, but it's happened. It is what it is. And fighting game coverage really isn't much better now than it was during the days of Tommy Tallarico, so clearly that's not a mark of improvement either. By the way, I find it so odd that his CVS2 review got so much play during this dust-up, because it was part of a segment called Reviews on the Run, and the gimmick for that mini-block was that Tallarico bulldogged the games, and his co-host Victor Lucas played the straight man. Tallarico spent a half-minute ripping on SNK for going bankrupt, for crying out loud. Obviously, it wasn't a totally serious review. You know what I really think? I think someone got tired of seeing the blame for this dark age laid at the feet of Evo and Capcom fans on social media and came up with another explanation to deflect from it. I think that as far as the community is concerned, the older players were stuck in a holding pattern, while the newer ones at the time branched off into anime fighters for a while, and now the two branches have been married into one pool as the FGC. And I think this wouldn't even be up for debate if people could go outside and do something, but they're bored and cooped up, so old topics are dredged up out of boredom and redefined in order to save face when something embarrassing comes up. It's happening more and more. Mark my words, before the year's out, someone's going to unironically say that KOF 2001 is underrated, and if someone says that to you in real life, run.